The freezing rain came down like shattered glass, each droplet turning to ice the moment it touched the Montana earth. Marcus Webb gripped the steering wheel of his Ford until his knuckles went white, squinting through the windshield where the wipers fought a losing battle against the sleet. The highway stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, slick and treacherous, bordered by pines that bent under the weight of accumulating ice. He was 3 miles from home when he heard it, a sound that cut through the drumming of rain on metal, through the growl of the engine, through every rational thought that told him to keep driving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was high and piercing, the kind of cry that speaks of terror in any language. Marcus eased his foot off the gas, the truck sliding slightly before the tires caught purchase on a patch of gravel. He leaned forward, breath fogging the glass, searching the darkness beyond his headlights. There, movement near the old grain trailer that had been abandoned on the roadside for as long as he could remember, rusted and listing to one side like a shipwreck. But this movement was frantic, alive, struggling against something that held it fast. He cut the engine and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a fist, stealing the air from his lungs. Ice pellets stung his face as he pulled his collar up and moved toward the commotion, boots crunching through the frozen crust that had formed over everything. The beam of his flashlight swept across the scene and his heart dropped into his stomach. 2 foals, barely old enough to be weaned from their mothers, were chained to the trailer's rusted axle. Their small bodies shook violently, steam rising from their coats in desperate plumes. One was black as midnight with a white star blazing on its forehead, the other a dappled gray that looked almost ghostly in the pale light. Both had heavy logging chains wrapped around their front legs, the metal biting into flesh that was never meant to bear such weight. The black foal reared up, eyes rolling white with panic, hoofs scrabbling against ice. The gray pressed itself against its companion, trembling so hard Marcus could hear the chains rattling even over the storm. He stood there for a moment, frozen by more than just the cold. 3 years ago he had walked away from everything. After the accident at the Billings rodeo, after they'd told him his son hadn't suffered, after the funeral where half the county had shown up to say words that meant nothing, he had shut the gates of his ranch and never looked back. The barn stood empty. The pastures grew wild. The only living thing he'd allowed himself to care for was the silence. Now here were 2 lives that would be extinguished by morning if he walked away. The choice should have been simple, but nothing had been simple since the day he'd buried his boy. Marcus moved closer, each step deliberate. The foals jerked at his approach, the black one lunging so hard the chain went taut with a metallic shriek. "Easy now," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The words came out like gravel, and used for so long they'd forgotten how to form softness. He could see their ribs pressing against hide, could see where the chains had rubbed the hair away in angry red circles. This wasn't neglect born of ignorance. Someone had done this with intention, had bound these young animals and left them to whatever fate the storm would bring. The anger that rose in him was clean and sharp, the first thing he'd felt in 3 years that wasn't the dull ache of loss. He knelt in the ice, ignoring the cold that soaked through his jeans, and examined the chains. Heavy-gauge logging chain, the kind used to haul timber, secured with padlocks that looked new despite the rust on everything else around them. Whoever had done this had come prepared. The black foal snorted, hot breath washing over Marcus's face, and he looked into those dark eyes and saw the same wild terror he'd felt the night they'd called him to the hospital. That desperate, clawing need to break free from something that couldn't be broken, couldn't be undone, couldn't be survived. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last thing he had from before, a red bandana, faded and worn, that had belonged to his son. Jake had worn it every time he'd ridden, tied around his neck like armor against fear. Marcus had carried it every day since, a weight in his pocket that reminded him of everything he'd failed to protect. He held it out slowly, letting the foals smell it, letting them understand through whatever language horses speak that he meant no harm. The dappled gray stretched its neck, nostrils flaring, then pulled back as if the gesture itself was too much trust to offer. But the black foal held steady, ears flicking forward just slightly, and in that microscopic shift Marcus saw possibility. His truck had a toolbox but no bolt cutters, nothing that could break through hardened steel. The nearest hardware store was 20 miles back toward town, and in this storm that might as well be 100. These foals didn't have 20 miles worth of time. The ice was building on their backs, their legs, weighing them down like the chains themselves. He could see hypothermia setting in, could see the way their movements were becoming sluggish, the way their heads hung lower with each passing minute. Marcus made his decision the way he'd made every hard decision in his life. Quickly, before thought could paralyze action. He went back to his truck and grabbed everything that might help. A length of rope, a tarp, a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and the old horse blanket he'd shoved under the seat and forgotten about. The blanket smelled like hay and leather and memory, but he pushed that aside and returned to the foals. He worked the rope around the black foal's neck first, moving with the careful patience his father had taught him decades ago when he was young enough to believe that patience could fix anything. The foal resisted, tossing its head, but exhaustion was winning over fear. Marcus kept his movements small, his voice low, a steady stream of meaningless words that carried tone instead of meaning. "You're going to be all right. We're going to figure this out. I'm not leaving you here." Whether he was talking to the foals or to himself, he couldn't say. The gray foal was harder. Every time he approached it shied away as far as the chains would allow, which wasn't far, but far enough to make the work dangerous. Those small hooves could crack ribs if they landed right, and Marcus was too old and too tired to pretend he was invincible. But he'd come this far, and turning back wasn't in him anymore. Maybe it never had been. He unwrapped the bandana from his hand and held it out again, this time with his palm open beneath it. The gray foal's ears swiveled, catching some signal Marcus couldn't name, and after a long moment it took a single step closer. Just one, but it was enough. Marcus slipped the rope over its neck, gentle as a prayer, and felt the animal's pulse hammering against the fiber. Both foals secured, he spread the tarp over them as best he could, tucking it against the wind that was picking up, driving the ice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Horizontal now. The blanket went over the black foal, the one that seemed stronger, seemed more likely to survive what came next. Then he stood back and looked at the chains. Without tools, without time, there was only one option left. He would have to bring them home like this, chains and all, and figure out the rest once they were out of the storm. His ranch was 2 miles up the road, 2 miles of frozen hell on a night when even the idea of moving seemed impossible. But impossible had stopped meaning much to Marcus Webb 3 years ago. He'd learned that the world kept turning even when you were certain it should stop, that morning came even after the darkest night, that sometimes you just had to put one foot in front of the other because standing still meant dying. He coaxed the foals forward, using the ropes to guide rather than force, speaking in that low, continuous rumble that seemed to calm them even as they stumbled on legs that barely worked. The black foal moved first, head low, following the gentle pressure of the rope. The gray came after, pressed close to its companion, the two of them moving as one organism bound by more than chains. The journey back to the truck was a nightmare of ice and darkness and animal fear. Marcus slipped twice, going down hard on his hip the second time, pain shooting through old injuries that had never quite healed. But he got back up because the foals were still moving, still trying, and if they could keep going then so could he. Getting them into the truck bed was impossible, so he didn't try. Instead he tied the ropes to the trailer hitch, keeping the length short enough that they'd have to stay close, long enough that they wouldn't be dragged. It wasn't elegant and it wasn't safe, and if anyone from his old life saw him doing this they'd call him 10 kinds of fool. But his old life was gone, and these foals needed him now. And that was all that mattered in this frozen moment on a Montana highway where the only witnesses were pine trees and gathering ice. He climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and began the slowest drive of his life. 5 miles per hour, maybe less, watching in the rearview mirror as 2 small dark shapes followed behind, their survival depending entirely on whether he could keep the truck steady on a road that wanted nothing more than to send them all sliding into the ditch. The 2 miles took 40 minutes. Every second of it was agony, watching those foals struggle, watching them slip and catch themselves, watching the ice build on their backs until they looked like creatures made of glass. Twice Marcus stopped completely, got out, and walked back to check on them, to murmur encouragement, to wipe ice from their faces with hands that had gone numb inside his gloves. The black foal, the one he'd already started thinking of as midnight in his head, met his eyes each time with something that wasn't quite trust but wasn't pure fear anymore either. The gray, the one that moved like an echo of its companion, stayed pressed close but wouldn't look at him directly, as if eye contact itself was too much vulnerability to offer. When the lights of his ranch finally appeared through the trees, Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Relief, maybe, or the beginning of something he'd thought was dead. The barn loomed ahead, dark and abandoned, exactly as he'd left it 3 years ago. He'd locked the doors after the funeral and never looked back, couldn't bear to see the empty stalls where his son had spent every free hour, couldn't stand the silence where there had always been the sound of Jake's laughter, the scrape of a brush on horse hide, the low murmur of a boy talking to animals like they understood every word. Now he would have to open those doors again, would have to step into that space that held more ghosts than would have to face everything he'd been running from. The truck rolled to a stop in the yard and Marcus sat there for a moment, engine idling, staring at the barn doors that had weathered 3 winters without opening. Ice covered everything, turning the familiar landscape into something alien and strange. The grain silo stood like a sentinel against the dark sky. The fence posts marched away into shadow, their wires singing in the wind. And behind him, 2 foals that would die if he didn't move. Marcus cut the engine and stepped out into the storm one more time. The cold had deepened, if that was possible, until each breath felt like inhaling knives. He untied the ropes from the trailer hitch, his fingers clumsy with cold and something deeper than cold, something that felt like fear mixed with purpose. The foals stood huddled together, steam rising from their bodies in thick clouds that the wind tore apart as quickly as they formed. He led them toward the barn, their hooves clicking against ice, chains dragging with a sound like judgment. The barn doors fought him, swollen from years of weather and neglect, the padlock so rusted he had to work it for 5 full minutes before the mechanism finally gave way. When he pulled the doors open, the smell that rolled out hit him like a physical force. Dust and old hay and the ghost of leather and horse sweat, all of it exactly as he'd left it. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He found the lantern where it had always hung, just inside the door on the left. His hands shook as he lit it, not from cold now but from something else, something that lived in the space between memory and present moment. The flame caught and grew, throwing long shadows across stalls that hadn't held life in far too long. The foals balked at the threshold, eyes wide, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scents. Marcus didn't force them. He simply stood inside, holding the lantern high, and waited. Waited the way his father had taught him, the way he'd taught Jake, the way patience had been passed down through generations of men who'd learned that force broke things while gentleness built bridges. Midnight took the first step, then another, hooves echoing hollow in the empty space. Echo followed, pressed so close they seemed to share a shadow, and together they crossed into the barn that had been waiting 3 years for life to return. Marcus closed the doors behind them, shutting out the storm, and in the sudden quiet he could hear nothing but the ragged breathing of 3 survivors trying to remember what safety felt like. The chains had to come off. That was the first thing, the most important thing. The thing that couldn't wait even though Marcus's hands were numb and his body was screaming for rest. He set the lantern on an overturned bucket and went to the tool wall where everything still hung exactly where his father had placed it 40 years ago. Bolt cutters, heavy and solid, the handles, wrapped in electrical tape that had gone sticky with age. He carried them back to where the foals stood trembling in the center of the main aisle. Midnight watched him approach with ears forward, alert but not panicked. Echo pressed against the larger foal's shoulder, taking comfort in proximity. Marcus knelt slowly, ignoring the protest from joints that had been through too much tonight, and positioned the cutters around the first link of chain. The metal was thick, resistant, but the cutters were good steel and his anger was better fuel. The chain parted with a sharp crack that made both foals jump. Marcus worked quickly after that, cutting away the logging chains link by link until they fell away in heavy coils that hit the floor like accusations. The damage underneath made his stomach turn. Raw flesh where the metal had rubbed, swelling that spoke of hours or maybe days of this torture, blood dried black in the creases. One of Echo's front legs was worse than the others, the skin broken in places, and when Marcus touched it gently the foal flinched so hard it nearly went down. "Easy," he murmured, hands hovering but not pressing. "Easy now. We're going to fix this." But even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. If anything could really be fixed, or if damage ran too deep, or if some wounds never stopped bleeding no matter how much time passed. He pushed the thought away and focused on what was in front of him. These foals needed water, needed food, needed warmth. Everything else could wait. The old water trough still worked, though it took several tries to get the pump going. The pipes groaned and spit rust before clear water finally flowed, cold enough to make his teeth ache when he tested it with his hand. He filled a bucket and carried it to the foals, setting it down within reach but not so close it felt like pressure. Midnight approached first, always the braver one, and dropped its muzzle into the bucket. The sound of drinking filled the barn, familiar and strange all at once. A sound Marcus hadn't heard in this space for 3 years. Echo waited, watching, until Midnight had finished before stepping forward for its own turn. They took turns like that, back and forth, a rhythm they'd established between themselves long before Marcus had found them. Partnership born of shared trauma, the kind of bond that needed no words. Hay was harder to find. Most of what had been left in the loft had rotted or been claimed by mice, but he finally located 2 bales near the back that were still good, still had that sweet grass smell that meant nutrition and life. He broke them open and spread the hay in 2 of the stalls, then scattered more in the aisle, creating a trail that would lead the foals where he wanted them to go without making it feel like captivity. They followed the breadcrumbs of hay, hunger winning over fear, and soon both were in adjacent stalls, heads down, chewing with the single-minded focus of animals who hadn't eaten in far too long. Marcus leaned against the door frame and watched them, his body finally beginning to register just how cold he was, how exhausted, how close to collapse. His clothes were soaked through, ice melting into freezing water that made him shake. His hands had started to ache with the deep throb that meant he'd pushed too far, been out in the cold too long. But he couldn't leave yet, couldn't walk away until he was certain they would make it through the night. He found horse blankets in the tack room, old ones that smelled of mildew but were still functional, and managed to drape one over each foal. They tolerated it, too tired to protest, too desperate for any source of warmth. Midnight even leaned into the weight of it, as if the pressure itself was comforting. With the foals settled as much as they could be, Marcus finally let himself sink down onto a hay bale near the wall. Just for a moment, he told himself, just to catch his breath. But the moment stretched, and the barn's warmth, relative though it was, began to seep into his bones, and his eyes grew heavy despite every intention to stay alert. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing across walls covered in hooks and halters and ribbons from competitions decades past. Marcus's gaze drifted to the corner where Jake's old saddle still sat on its stand, exactly where his son had left it. Smaller than an adult saddle, worn smooth in places from hours of use, the leather dark with oil and sweat and time. He hadn't been able to look at it for 3 years, hadn't been able to touch it or move it or do anything but lock the door and pretend it didn't exist. Now, with 2 foals breathing quietly in the stalls nearby, with the sound of hay being chewed and the creak of old wood settling, he found he could look, could see it not as a monument to loss but as evidence that something good had existed here once. That love and care and patience had filled this space. That maybe, just maybe, they could fill it again. Morning came reluctantly, gray light seeping through cracks in the barn walls like something uncertain of its welcome. Marcus woke with a start, his neck stiff from sleeping upright against the wall, his body protesting every small movement. For a disorienting moment he couldn't remember where he was or why the air smelled of horse and damp hay instead of the stale coffee and silence of his cabin. Then he heard it, the soft shuffle of hooves on straw, the quiet breathing of large animals, and memory crashed back with the force of the ice storm that still rattled against the roof. He pushed himself upright, joints cracking, and moved slowly toward the stalls. His breath plumed white in the cold air. The barn had no heat, hadn't in years, and the temperature inside was barely warmer than outside. But it was shelter from the wind, protection from the freezing rain, and right now that difference meant everything. Midnight stood in the first stall, head lifted, ears swiveling toward the sound of Marcus's approach. The white star on its forehead caught what little light filtered through the boards, making it look almost luminous. The foal's dark eyes tracked Marcus's every movement, alert but not panicked, a significant shift from the wild terror of the night before. In the adjacent stall, Echo pressed against the far wall, gray coat blending with shadows, making it look more spirit than solid flesh. This one watched Marcus sideways, head turned just enough to keep him in peripheral vision, ready to bolt even though there was nowhere to go. Marcus stopped several feet from the stalls, making no sudden movements, no aggressive eye contact. He'd learned decades ago that horses read intention before action, that they could sense predatory energy the way water finds cracks in stone. He kept his shoulders relaxed, his gaze soft, his breathing steady. "Good morning," he said quietly, voice still rough from sleep and cold. The words felt strange in his mouth, felt like something from a life he'd left behind, but they came anyway. "You two made it through the night. That's something." Midnight shifted weight from one front leg to the other, a small movement that drew Marcus's attention to the wounds. In daylight, they looked worse than they had by lantern glow. The flesh around both front legs was swollen, angry red in places, raw where the chains had abraded through skin and into the tissue beneath. Dried blood crusted in dark lines. The left leg seemed worse, the foal favoring it slightly when it moved. Echo's injuries were harder to assess from a distance, but Marcus could see the way the gray foal held its right front leg, barely putting weight on it, the trembling in the muscles that suggested either pain or exhaustion or both. These wounds needed attention, needed cleaning and medication, needed hands that knew what they were doing. Marcus thought of Trish Kincaid, the large animal vet who'd worked on his horses for 2 decades, who'd been at Jake's funeral and had tried to call him a dozen times after, calls he'd never returned. He'd have to reach out, have to ask for help, have to open himself up to the questions and concern and pity he'd been avoiding. The thought made something twist in his gut, but he pushed it aside. His comfort mattered less than these foals' survival. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, learned that pride was a luxury and vulnerability was just the price of staying human. First things first, though. Water and food, the basics that kept breath in lungs and heart beating. He checked the bucket he'd filled the night before. Empty, licked clean. A good sign. Thirst was a powerful motivator, and the fact that both foals had drunk meant their bodies were still fighting, still trying to repair the damage that had been done. He refilled the bucket at the pump, the water running clear and cold, mineral-rich from the well his grandfather had dug by hand 70 years ago. He carried it back and set it where both foals could reach it, then stepped away to give them space. Midnight approached first, always the bolder one, and drank deeply, sides heaving with each swallow. Echo waited, watching, only coming forward when Midnight had backed away. The pattern repeated from the night before, this careful negotiation of need and fear, this dance of trust that required both distance and proximity. While they drank, Marcus moved through the barn with purpose he hadn't felt in years. He located an old medical kit in the tack room, dusty and probably expired but better than nothing. Antiseptic, gauze, tape, scissors. He found iodine in a bottle so old the label had faded to illegibility, and a tube of antibiotic ointment that had hardened at the cap but was still soft inside. He gathered clean rags from a bin, shook out the mouse droppings, and added them to his collection. Then he stood looking at his supplies, inadequate as they were, and began formulating a plan. The wounds needed to be cleaned first, debris and dried blood removed so he could see the true extent of the damage. Then disinfection, then application of whatever medication he had available. Bandaging would come last, though he wasn't sure either foal would tolerate wrapping on their legs. Horses were funny about their legs, skittish about anything that restricted movement, and these two had already experienced restraint as trauma. He'd have to be careful, patient, willing to work in increments rather than completing everything at once. He carried his supplies to the stalls and set them just outside Midnight's door. The foal watched him arrange items, ears flicking with curiosity, nostrils expanding to catch the sharp medicinal scents. Marcus opened the stall door slowly, telegraphing his intention with every movement, and stepped inside. The space felt immediately smaller with both of them in it, the foal's presence filling the stall with warmth and wild energy barely contained. Midnight didn't retreat, didn't charge, simply stood watching with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to be calculating odds, weighing risk against need. Marcus knelt in the straw, ignoring the cold that soaked through his jeans, making himself small, making himself less threatening. He pulled a handful of hay from the net he'd hung the night before and held it out, arm extended, palm up, the oldest peace offering in the history of humans and horses. For a long moment nothing happened. The foal stood motionless, carved from shadow and starlight, breath pluming in the cold air. Then, slowly, deliberately, Midnight took a step forward. One small hoof placement, testing, questioning. Marcus held perfectly still, barely breathing, letting the foal control the pace of approach. Another step, another, until soft lips touched his palm, warm and alive, and began pulling hay with gentle precision. The contact sent something electric through Marcus, a jolt of connection he hadn't felt since Jake had stood in this very barn, hand-feeding a colt they'd raised from birth, laughing when it lipped at his jacket looking for treats. The memory hurt, sharp and immediate, but Marcus didn't pull away from it this time, didn't shove it down or lock it away. He let it exist alongside this moment, past and present overlapping like images on film. While Midnight ate, Marcus let his free hand rise slowly, moving with the kind of patience that counted seconds like heartbeats. He touched the foal's shoulder first, just the lightest contact, fingers barely pressing into coarse hair and firm muscle beneath. Midnight's skin twitched, a reflexive response, but the foal didn't pull away. Encouraged, Marcus let his hand drift lower, down toward the damaged leg. The moment he touched near the wound, Midnight jerked back, eyes going wide, weight shifting to the back legs in preparation for flight or fight. Marcus froze, hands suspended in air, and began talking. Low, steady, meaningless words that created sound without pressure. It's all right. I know it hurts. We're gonna make it better. Just need to look. Just need to see what we're working with. Won't hurt you. Promise I won't hurt you. The words tumbled out, forming a bridge between them, and gradually Midnight's breathing slowed, the panic in its eyes dimming to wariness. Marcus tried again, this time approaching from a different angle, letting his hand rest on the foal's chest first, establishing contact somewhere safe before moving toward danger. He could feel the heart hammering beneath his palm, could feel the tremor of fear running through muscle and bone. He kept his touch light, his movements slow, and inch by inch worked his way down toward the injured leg. When he finally reached the wound, Midnight flinched but held steady, and Marcus was able to examine what the chains had done. The damage was extensive but not catastrophic. The flesh was torn in places, abraded raw in others, swollen with fluid that spoke of infection beginning its work. The joint above the hoof seemed intact, no heat that would indicate deeper trauma, no grinding sensation that meant broken bone. This was surface damage, painful and ugly, but healable with time and care. Marcus felt relief wash through him, followed immediately by the weight of responsibility. This foal would need daily attention for weeks, maybe months. Would need medication, bandage changes, monitoring for infection. Would need someone willing to show up every day, willing to do the work even when it was hard, even when it hurt. He hadn't been that someone for 3 years, hadn't been able to show up for himself, much less anything else. But looking at Midnight, at the trust beginning to form in those dark eyes, he felt something shift inside his chest. Felt the locked door he'd built around himself crack open just slightly, letting in both light and obligation. He dampened a clean rag with warm water from his thermos, added a splash of antiseptic, and began cleaning the wound. Midnight danced sideways at the first touch, the sting of disinfectant sharp and immediate, but Marcus kept talking, kept his hand steady, and gradually the foal stilled. He worked with methodical care, wiping away dried blood and debris, revealing the full extent of the injury. It took 20 minutes to clean both front legs, 20 minutes of patient repetition, of small advances and minor setbacks, of building trust 1 second at a time. When he finally finished, both wounds were clean and beginning to seep clear fluid, the body's attempt at healing already underway. Marcus applied antibiotic ointment with gentle fingers, then sat back on his heels and looked at his work. It wasn't perfect, wasn't what Trish would have done with her training and proper equipment, but it was a start. It was care offered and accepted, which was more than Marcus had managed in a very long time. He gathered his supplies and moved to Echo's stall, knowing this would be harder, knowing the gray foal hadn't yet decided whether humans were saviors or threats. Echo pressed against the far wall when Marcus entered, head high, nostrils flared, every line of its body screaming retreat. But there was nowhere to retreat to, no escape from this enclosed space, and Marcus could see the calculation happening behind those wide eyes. Fight or submit, resist or allow. Choose the devil you know or the devil you don't. Marcus didn't approach directly. Instead, he sat down in the straw near the door, making himself small again, removing the threat of his height and reach. He pulled out the bandana from his pocket, Jake's bandana, faded red and soft with age, and simply held it. The smell of it, still faintly carrying the scent of the cologne Jake had worn, the cheap stuff teenage boys bought at drugstores, filled the space between them. Echo's nostrils flared wider, reading the story written in scent molecules, processing information Marcus couldn't name. Time passed. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Marcus didn't move except to breathe, didn't speak except to exist. He'd learned this from his father, learned that sometimes the best thing you could offer was patience emptied of expectation, presence without demand. Echo shifted weight, the injured leg lifting slightly, and Marcus saw the extent of the damage. Worse than Midnight's, the chain had cut deeper here, and the swelling extended higher up the leg, suggesting possible tendon involvement. His chest tightened with concern, but he kept his face neutral, his energy calm. After what felt like an eternity, Echo took a single step away from the wall. Just one, barely moving, but it was movement toward rather than away, and that changed everything. Marcus stayed seated, stay small, and held out the bandana the way he'd held out hay to Midnight. No food this time, just fabric and memory and the offer of something soft in a world that had been hard. Echo stretched its neck, nose extended, and sniffed. The gray foal's breath was warm against Marcus's hand, moisture condensing on his skin. Then, in a gesture so gentle it almost broke him, Echo's soft muzzle touched the bandana, pressed against it briefly, and pulled away. Marcus felt tears sting his eyes, hot and unexpected. He blinked them back, cleared his throat, and finally spoke. Yeah, he said quietly, that belonged to someone brave. Someone who loved horses more than just about anything. Someone who would have wanted to help you. The words hung in the cold air, truth and grief tangled together like the chains had been. Echo watched him with one dark eye, head tilted, and Marcus wondered what horses understood about loss, about the holes people carried inside them, about the way love persisted even after its object was gone. He didn't know, couldn't know, but he felt seen in that moment, recognized in some fundamental way that bypassed language. He rose slowly, joints protesting, and approached Echo with supplies in hand. The foal tensed but didn't bolt, and Marcus took that as permission. He worked faster this time, knowing the window of tolerance was smaller, that Echo's willingness to be touched was a gift that could be revoked at any second. The wounds were indeed worse, deep enough in places that Marcus could see structures beneath skin, tendons and ligaments that should never be exposed to air. His stomach turned, but his hands stayed steady as he cleaned, as he applied ointment, as he murmured apologies for the pain he was causing even as he tried to heal. Echo trembled through the entire process, body rigid with endurance rather than acceptance. But the foal stood and let Marcus work, and that was courage of a kind Marcus recognized. The courage of surviving something terrible and still choosing to trust, even just a little, even just enough. When he finished with Echo, the sun had climbed higher, pale light strengthening through the storm that had finally begun to ease. Marcus stood in the barn aisle, surrounded by the evidence of a night that had changed everything, and felt the weight of what he'd taken on. 2 injured foals that would need constant care. A barn he'd sworn never to enter again, now housing life that depended on him. Connections forming whether he wanted them or not, whether he was ready or not, whether he deserved them or not. He thought about calling Trish, about reaching out for the help he clearly needed. But first he wanted to give these foals a few hours of peace, wanted them to eat and rest without more hands on wounds, more probing and prodding and human intervention. He hung fresh hay nets in both stalls, filled water buckets, and spread extra straw for bedding. Then he stood at the barn door and looked back at Midnight and Echo, both visible in their adjacent stalls, both watching him with varying degrees of wariness and something that might, given time, become trust. The storm outside had diminished to scattered ice pellets that ticked against metal like thoughts against consciousness. The world was locked in frozen stillness, waiting for the thaw that would come eventually but hadn't yet arrived. Marcus pulled his coat tighter and stepped into that frozen world, leaving the barn door cracked so air could circulate but warmth wouldn't entirely escape. His boots crunched on ice as he crossed the yard toward his cabin, and with each step he felt the shift happening inside him, tectonic plates of self moving after years of being locked in place. He'd rescued 2 foals from a storm, but standing in the pale morning light with exhaustion pulling at every muscle, he wondered if maybe they were rescuing him right back. The cabin felt smaller than Marcus remembered, the walls pressing in with the weight of 3 years' accumulated silence. He shed his wet clothes in a pile by the door, ice crystals falling from the fabric like shed skin, and stood shivering in the main room where nothing had changed because he'd allowed nothing to change. The same coffee mug sat on the same table, the same boots lined up by the same chair. Even the calendar on the wall still showed March 3 years ago, the date circled in red marker where time had stopped and never started again. He moved mechanically toward the bathroom, turned the shower as hot as it would go, and stood under the spray until feeling returned to his extremities in painful waves. The water beat against muscles that had been pushed beyond their limits, carrying away the night's cold but not its memory. When he finally emerged, skin pink and raw, steam filled the small space like fog, obscuring the mirror where he might have had to look at himself. He dressed in clean clothes that hung looser than they once had, pulled on thick socks and his spare boots, and forced himself to eat something even though his stomach churned with exhaustion and something deeper. 2 pieces of toast with peanut butter, mechanical chewing that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the knowledge that his body needed fuel for what came next. Because he couldn't stop now, couldn't rest even though every cell in his body screamed for sleep. The foals were stable for the moment, but stable wasn't the same as safe. Those wounds needed professional attention, needed someone who understood infection and inflammation and all the ways damaged tissue could turn from bad to catastrophic. He needed Trish Kincaid, needed her expertise and her discretion and her willingness to show up without asking the questions he wasn't ready to answer. He pulled his phone from the charger where it had sat unused for days, maybe weeks, and stared at the screen. 23 missed calls, most of them old, most of them from numbers he'd stopped recognizing as anything but unwanted connection. He scrolled through the contacts he hadn't deleted, couldn't quite bring himself to delete, and found her name. His thumb hovered over the call button while doubt flooded through him like ice water. What would he say? How did you ask for help after 3 years of radio silence? After ignoring every attempt at reaching out? After making it abundantly clear you wanted nothing from anyone? How did you admit that maybe you'd been wrong, that isolation wasn't healing, that the walls you'd built to keep out pain had also kept out everything else? The phone felt heavy in his hand, dense with all the conversations he'd avoided, all the connections he'd severed, all the bridges he'd burned not because he wanted to but because he hadn't known how else to survive the unsurvivable. He thought of Midnight standing in the stall, thought of Echo pressed against the wall, thought of 2 young animals who hadn't asked for any of this but were depending on him anyway. They didn't care about his comfort or his pride or his carefully maintained distance from the world. They just needed help, the kind he couldn't give alone. Marcus pressed the call button before he could talk himself out of it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and with each ring his heart rate climbed. Maybe she wouldn't answer. Maybe she'd deleted his number. written him off as a lost cause, moved on to people who actually wanted help instead of those who pushed it away. On the fourth ring, she picked up. The voice that came through was exactly as he remembered, warm and direct with the kind of confidence that came from decades of dealing with animals and the humans who loved them. Kincaid. The single word, professional and neutral, gave him nothing to work with. Marcus cleared his throat, suddenly aware that he hadn't used his voice for anything but murmuring to horses in hours. Trish. This Marcus Webb. Silence on the other end, long enough that he wondered if the connection had dropped. Then her voice came back, different now, softer but also sharper, like she was recalibrating everything she knew about the world to account for this impossible thing. Marcus. A statement, not a question. Yeah. More silence. He could hear her breathing, could almost feel her deciding how to respond, what to say to someone who'd vanished into grief and was now suddenly calling out of the void. He plunged ahead before she could speak, before he could lose his nerve. I need help. Got 2 foals out here, young ones, maybe 6 or 8 months. Found them chained up on the highway last night during the storm. Wounds on their legs, bad ones. I've cleaned them, but they need more than what I can do. The words came out in a rush, facts stacked on facts. A wall built from information to keep out emotion. Another pause, shorter this time, and when Trish spoke he could hear her shifting into professional mode, the place where crisis became checklist and panic became protocol. How bad are the wounds? Deep in places. Swelling, some heat. Cleaned them with what I had, but one of them, the gray, it's worse. Might be tendon involvement. All right, I can be there in 45 minutes. Roads are still bad from the storm. Relief flooded through him, so intense it left him dizzy. Thank you, Marcus. She stopped, and he waited for the question, for the inevitable why now, why this, why break 3 years of silence for horses when you wouldn't break it for people. But she surprised him. I'll bring everything we need. You just keep them warm and quiet until I get there. The line went dead and Marcus stood holding the phone, staring at nothing, feeling like he just crossed a bridge he couldn't uncross. Trish was coming. The isolation was ending, whether he was ready or not. He shoved the phone in his pocket and headed back out into the cold. The storm had stopped completely now, leaving behind a landscape transformed into crystal and ice. Every surface glittered, sharp and beautiful and dangerous. The pine trees bowed under the weight of frozen rain, branches encased in sleeves of clear ice that clicked and chimed in the breeze like wind chimes made of glass. The barn looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, more weathered. He could see gaps in the boards where time and neglect had taken their toll, could see rust bleeding down from nail heads, could see all the ways the structure had aged without his attention. But it was still standing, still solid enough to shelter life, and right now that was all that mattered. Inside, both foals lifted their heads at his entrance. Midnight nickered softly, a sound that went straight through Marcus's chest like an arrow. Echo remained silent but tracked his movement, and Marcus chose to see that as progress. He checked their water, refreshed the hay, and then simply stood in the aisle between their stalls, watching them exist. There was something hypnotic about it, the way they moved through space, the way their ears swiveled to catch sounds he couldn't hear, the way they breathed in rhythm with each other like they were sharing one set of lungs. They'd survived something terrible together, had been bound by chains and fear and the very real possibility of death. And now they were here, damaged but alive, and somehow that fact alone felt significant. Marcus thought about the rodeo, about the day everything had ended. Jake had drawn a bad bronc. Everyone knew it. A horse with a reputation for violence and unpredictability. But Jake had climbed on anyway because that's what you did, because backing down wasn't an option when you were 18 and immortal and too stupid to understand that immortality was a lie. 8 seconds. That's all it had taken. 8 seconds of violent motion, of Jake's body whipping like a flag in a hurricane, of the crowd roaring and the buzzer screaming, and then the dismount that went wrong. The way Jake's boot had caught in the rigging, the way the bronc had kept bucking with Jake's body dragging, the way time had stretched and contracted until Marcus wasn't sure if it lasted seconds or hours, the way the clowns had finally freed his son, and the way Jake had lain so still in the dirt, and the way Marcus had known before the medics reached him, had known with the terrible certainty of every parent's nightmare, that this was the wound that didn't heal. He'd replayed it 10,000 times since then, searching for the moment where intervention might have changed outcome, the split second where different choices could have led to different endings. But there was no such moment, had never been, because some things in life are simply beyond control, beyond prevention, beyond the reach of even the most desperate love. The Foals couldn't know any of this, couldn't understand the weight Marcus carried, or the way their presence pulled at seams he'd thought were sealed. But maybe that was exactly why he could be here with them, could show up when he hadn't been able to show up for anything else. They asked nothing of him but presence and care, required no explanation for his failures, demanded no justification for his grief. They simply existed, needed help, and accepted what he could offer without judging what he couldn't. 45 minutes, Trish had said. Marcus used the time to make the barn as ready as he could. He swept the aisle, clearing away the debris of abandonment, pushing mouse droppings and old straw into piles that he carried out to the compost heap behind the structure. He located the old examining area his father had built, a small enclosed space with good light and tie rails where horses could be secured for treatment. The space was thick with dust and cobwebs, home to spiders that scattered when he entered, but the structure was sound. He swept it clean, tested the tie rails to make sure they'd hold, and positioned 2 lanterns for extra light. Then he went through the tack room systematically, inventorying what remained usable after 3 years of neglect. Lead ropes, mostly intact. Halters in various sizes, though some had cracked leather that would need replacing. Brushes and curry combs that could be cleaned. A few blankets that weren't completely destroyed by mice. Not much, but more than nothing, and right now nothing was the only alternative. He was hanging the last lantern when he heard the sound of tires crunching on ice, the low rumble of an engine approaching. His stomach clenched with anxiety that felt ridiculous and unavoidable in equal measure. Trish had been his friend once, had been Jake's vet and confidant, and the person who'd helped birth half the colts his son had raised. But 3 years was a long time to shut someone out, and Marcus had no idea what waited on the other side of that barn door. The truck that pulled into the yard was new, or at least newer than he remembered, a heavy-duty Ford with veterinary insignia on the door and a camper shell covering the bed. It parked near the barn entrance and the engine cut off, leaving sudden silence that felt louder than noise. Marcus wiped his palms on his jeans, realized he was nervous, and felt annoyed at himself for feeling nervous. This was about the Foals, not about him, not about reconnection or reconciliation or any of the complicated human things that made simple actions difficult. The truck door opened and Trish stepped out, and Marcus was struck by how much the same she looked and how different. Same short gray hair, same practical clothes, same boots that had seen 1,000 barns. But there were new lines around her eyes, deeper grooves beside her mouth, the visible evidence of years that had passed for everyone, not just him. She pulled a large case from the truck bed, hoisted it with practiced ease, and walked toward him without hesitation. Their eyes met across the yard and Marcus saw something in her expression that made his throat tight. Not pity, thank God, but something closer to understanding, or maybe just the willingness to suspend judgment until facts presented themselves. She reached the barn door and stopped, setting the case down, and for a moment they just stood there. 2 people separated by silence and choice and the wreckage of friendship that had been collateral damage to grief. Marcus, she said finally, and there was no accusation in it, no anger, just his name offered like a hand reaching across distance. Trish, thank you for coming. She nodded once, picked up her case, and stepped past him into the barn. Her gaze swept the space, taking in the swept floors, the occupied stalls, the evidence of recent activity after long abandonment, and he saw her processing it all, reading the story written in dust and fresh hay and 2 small faces watching from shadows. Let me see them, she said, and it was a command born of purpose rather than authority, the voice of someone who knew exactly what needed to happen next. Marcus led her to Midnight's stall first. The black foal retreated slightly at the approach of a stranger, but Trish moved with the same patient deliberation Marcus had used, making herself small, making herself safe. She stood at the stall door for a long moment, just observing, and Marcus remembered this about her, the way she always watched before acting, reading body language and energy before ever laying hands on an animal. Beautiful, she said quietly. Young though. Too young to be away from its mother. I know. She glanced at him, and in that glance was a question she didn't voice. Where did they come from? Who would do this? What exactly had he stumbled into? But she didn't ask, just turned back to the foal and began the slow process of introduction. She talked while she worked, voice low and steady, narrating her intentions before executing them. I'm going to come in now. Just going to look at you. Not going to hurt you. Just need to see what we're working with. The words were for the horse but also for Marcus, he realized, a way of including him in the process of teaching without seeming to teach. She entered the stall and Midnight allowed it, perhaps recognizing something in Trish that spoke of competence and care, perhaps simply too tired to maintain constant vigilance. Trish ran her hands over the foal's body with professional thoroughness, checking temperature, feeling for abnormalities, assessing condition beyond the obvious wounds. Too thin, she murmured. Dehydrated. Probably been neglected for a while before the chains. Her fingers traced the injuries on the front legs and Marcus saw her expression harden. Saw anger flash across her features before she locked it away behind clinical assessment. This is deliberate, she said, and it wasn't a question. Marcus nodded, throat too tight for words. Trish pulled supplies from her case, moving with efficient grace. She administered a broad-spectrum antibiotic via injection. Midnight flinching at the needle but holding steady. Then she cleaned the wounds again with proper solutions, better than what Marcus had managed, and applied a thick coating of prescription-strength ointment before wrapping each leg in gauze and cohesive bandage. The foal stood through all of it, trembling but trusting, and when Trish finished she stroked Midnight's neck with genuine affection. You're a brave one, aren't you? Going to be all right. Going to heal up just fine. She moved to Echo's stall and the process repeated, though this time with more difficulty. The gray foal was less willing to accept a stranger, more defensive of the wounds that hurt worse, and it took both Marcus and Trish working together to accomplish what needed doing. Marcus held Echo's lead rope, keeping the foal's head steady, while Trish examined and treated. Her face grew more serious as she worked, and Marcus felt dread pool in his stomach. When she finally stepped back, wiping her hands on a towel, her expression was grim. This one's worse. The chain went deep enough to damage the digital flexor tendon. It's not severed, but it's compromised. Needs to be kept immobile as much as possible while it heals, which with a young horse is nearly impossible. Marcus processed this, understanding filtering through like water through sand. How bad? Bad enough that, if it doesn't heal right, this foal could have permanent lameness. Bad enough that we need to consider whether rehabilitation is kind or cruel. The words hit like fists. Marcus looked at Echo, at the small gray shape pressed against the stall wall, at the dark eyes watching them with wariness born of pain and betrayal, and felt something fierce rise in his chest. We don't give up, he said, and his voice came out harder than he'd intended. We do what needs doing, whatever it takes, but we don't give up. Trish studied him for a long moment, and he couldn't read what she was thinking, couldn't tell if she saw strength or delusion, commitment or denial. Then she nodded slowly. All right, but it means you're in this for the long haul, Marcus. Months of care, maybe longer. Daily bandage changes, medication schedules, monitoring for infection. These foals will need you to show up every single day, multiple times a day. Can you do that? The question hung between them, heavier than its simple words suggested. Could he do that? Could he commit to something that required consistency when his last 3 years had been defined by withdrawal? Could he promise to show up for these animals when he'd failed to show up for himself? He looked at Midnight, then at Echo, then back at Trish, and felt the answer settle in his bones with the weight of certainty. Yes, he said, I can do that. Something shifted in Trish's expression, some calculation being made, some assessment of his reliability being tabulated. Finally, she reached into her case and pulled out a printed sheet, a care protocol with instructions detailed in her neat handwriting. This is the schedule. Antibiotics twice daily. Bandage changes every other day or more often if they get wet or dirty. Keep the wounds clean and dry. Watch for heat, swelling, discharge. Any change in appetite or behavior, you call me immediately. She handed him the paper and their fingers brushed. Brief contact that felt like more than it was. He took the sheet, folded it carefully, put it in his pocket like a contract he was signing. Trish packed her supplies methodically, each item returning to its designated space in the case. When she finished, she stood and faced him directly, and Marcus braced himself for the questions he'd been dreading. But again she surprised him. "I'm glad you called, Marcus." She said it simply, without elaboration, and before he could respond she'd picked up her case and headed for the door. He followed her out into the cold where her truck waited, engine block still ticking as it cooled. She loaded her equipment into the back, then paused with her hand on the driver's door. "Marcus." He looked at her across the hood of the truck. This woman who'd been part of his life when he'd had a life, who'd witnessed his world before it shattered. "Jake would be proud of you," she said. "For this. For them." The words struck something deep inside him, some tender place he'd thought was deadened beyond feeling. His eyes burned and he looked away, blinking hard against the cold wind that suddenly seemed sharper. When he looked back, Trish had climbed into the truck. She started the engine, rolled down the window. "I'll check on them in 3 days. You need me before then, you call. Don't wait. Don't try to handle it alone. These foals need you, but that doesn't mean you have to do it by yourself." She drove away before he could answer, tires crunching on ice, leaving Marcus standing in the yard with her words echoing in the space where his defenses used to be. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Marcus hadn't known he was capable of anymore. Morning came early, before the sun broke over the Bitterroot Peaks, when the world was still gray and uncertain. He'd wake in the cabin that felt less like a tomb now and more like a staging ground, pull on clothes that smelled of hay and horse, and make his way across the frozen yard to the barn where 2 lives waited for his arrival. Midnight always greeted him first, that soft nicker that had become as reliable as sunrise, a sound that said you came back, you're here, we're still alive together. Echo took longer to acknowledge his presence, but Marcus had learned to read the small signs. The way the gray foal's ear would swivel toward his voice even when its body stayed pressed to the far wall. The way it would shift weight off the injured leg when he approached, a gesture of vulnerability that felt like trust even if it wasn't quite there yet. He cleaned wounds twice daily following Trish's protocol with a devotion that bordered on religious. The antiseptic stung, he knew it did, could see it in the way both foals flinched at first contact, but they learned to stand for it. Learned that the sting preceded relief, that his hands meant care even when they caused momentary pain. The wounds themselves were responding, edges beginning to knit together, swelling receding incrementally, the angry red fading to pink that spoke of healing rather than infection. Echo's tendon remained the concern, that deep damage invisible to the eye but present in every careful step the foal took. Marcus watched for signs of deterioration with the kind of attention he'd once reserved for reading weather patterns and stock reports, back when the ranch was a living thing and he'd believed the future was something you could plan for. Tommy Brennan appeared on the 3rd morning, materializing out of the cold like a ghost Marcus hadn't known he'd been expecting. The boy stood at the edge of the property line, hands shoved deep in pockets of a coat that had been his father's, Roy Brennan's old canvas jacket that swallowed the child's thin frame. Marcus saw him from the barn door and felt his chest constrict with complicated emotion. Roy had worked this ranch for 15 years, had been more brother than employee, had taught Jake how to rope and ride and read the land. Roy, who'd driven off one winter evening to check fence lines and never came home. His truck found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine where black ice had sent it spinning off the mountain road. That had been 4 years ago now, and Marcus had thought the loss of Roy had been the worst thing that could happen until Jake proved him catastrophically wrong. He hadn't seen Tommy since the funeral, hadn't been able to look at the boy without seeing Roy's face, hearing Roy's laugh, feeling the weight of all the ways the world took good people and left holes that nothing could fill. But here Tommy stood, 10 years old now, wearing his dead father's jacket, and Marcus couldn't turn away. The boy didn't speak at first, just stood watching Marcus cross the yard. When Marcus reached him, he saw that Tommy held something clutched in his oversized work gloves. A paper sack, grease-stained and folded at the top. "Ma heard you had horses again," Tommy said, voice higher than it would be in a few years but already carrying the careful inflection of someone who'd learned early that words had weight. "She sent biscuits. Said you probably weren't eating right." Marcus took the bag, felt warmth still radiating through paper, and his throat went tight. "Tell her thank you. That was real kind." Tommy nodded, scuffing one boot through ice crystals that had formed overnight in elaborate patterns across the dirt. Then his eyes lifted past Marcus toward the barn, and something in his expression shifted from cautious to curious. "Can I see them? The horses?" Marcus's first instinct was to say no, to send the boy home, to maintain the boundaries that had kept everyone at safe distance for 3 years. But something in Tommy's face, the naked hope there unguarded by the cynicism that would come later, made him hesitate. "They're not really horses yet. Just foals. Young ones. And they've been hurt bad. Might not be something you want to see." Tommy's jaw set in a way that reminded Marcus painfully of Roy. "I've seen hurt before." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity or drama, carried truth that Marcus couldn't argue with. This boy had lost his father, had watched his mother struggle to keep food on the table and heat in the house, had grown up faster than childhood should require. Hurt wasn't foreign to him. "All right," Marcus said finally. "But you move slow and quiet. They're still learning that people aren't all bad." Tommy followed him into the barn with footsteps so careful they barely made sound. The foals both lifted their heads at the intrusion, Midnight with interest, Echo with immediate wariness. Marcus positioned himself between Tommy and the stalls, a buffer in case things went wrong, but he needn't have worried. The boy seemed to understand instinctively how to make himself unthreatening. He didn't rush forward or reach out, didn't make loud exclamations or sudden movements. He simply stood at the stall door and looked at Midnight with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail. "It's beautiful," Tommy whispered, and the reverence in his voice made something crack open in Marcus's chest. "My dad used to say horses were like poems. You had to read them slow to understand what they meant." Marcus hadn't known Roy had said that, hadn't known his friend had carried poetry in his head alongside all the practical knowledge of ranch work and livestock management. The discovery felt like finding money in an old coat pocket, unexpected treasure that made the loss somehow both sharper and more bearable. "Your dad was right about a lot of things," Marcus said quietly. Tommy glanced at him sideways, some question forming in his young face. But before he could voice it, Midnight moved forward, curious about this new small human who smelled different than Marcus, who carried the scent of breakfast cooking and laundry soap and childhood. The foal's nose extended toward Tommy's hand and the boy froze, barely breathing, letting Midnight investigate. When those soft lips touched his palm, Tommy's face transformed, lit from within by wonder so pure it hurt to witness. Marcus watched boy and foal connect across the space where words weren't necessary, where the language spoken was older than English or any human tongue, and felt layers of his own armor beginning to flake away like old paint. This was what Trish had meant, he thought. This showing up, this being present, this allowing something beyond yourself to matter. It wasn't easy and it wasn't comfortable, and it required showing the soft, vulnerable places he'd been protecting with isolation and silence. But watching Tommy's careful joy, seeing Midnight accept affection from someone new, Marcus understood that maybe healing wasn't something you did alone in the dark. Maybe it was something that happened when you let light in, even just cracks of it, even just enough to see by. Tommy visited every day after that. He'd appear after school, coat flapping, cheeks red from the cold walk from where the bus dropped him a mile down the road. He never asked permission, just showed up and made himself useful in ways that suggested Roy had trained him well before dying. He'd fetch water, spread fresh hay, sweep the aisle until dust motes danced in the thin winter light that filtered through gaps in the barn walls. He talked while he worked, a steady stream of observations and questions and stories about his day that filled the silence Marcus had grown so accustomed to. The boy's presence changed the barn's atmosphere, made it feel less like a museum of memory and more like a space where present tense mattered. Midnight responded to Tommy with the same trust the foal showed Marcus, maybe more. There was something about the boy's energy, uncomplicated and genuinely kind, that the young horse recognized as safe. Echo remained more reserved, but Marcus noticed the gray foal watching Tommy with less alarm as days passed. Noticed it didn't retreat to the far wall anymore when the boy entered its stall. On the 5th day, Tommy brought carrots from his mother's kitchen, precious vegetables from a root cellar that probably didn't have much surplus to spare. He held them out with palms flat the way Marcus had taught him, and Midnight crunched through them with obvious pleasure. Echo watched from its stall, torn between desire and distrust, and Tommy showed patience beyond his years. He simply set a carrot on the ground near Echo's hooves and stepped back, giving the full space to decide. They watched together as Echo's nose lowered, sniffed, and finally lips pulled the carrot into its mouth. Tommy grinned at Marcus, gap-toothed and triumphant, and Marcus found himself smiling back, facial muscles moving in expressions he'd almost forgotten how to form. That night, after Tommy had gone home and the foals were settled for evening feeding, Marcus sat in the barn the way he'd taken to doing lately. Not working, not treating wounds, just existing in the space while around him life happened in small increments. Midnight dozed standing, one hip cocked, head low. Echo shifted weight off its injured leg, the movement now automatic, compensatory. The lantern threw shadows that moved when wind found its way through cracks, and outside the world grew dark under a sky clearing enough to show stars. Marcus pulled Jake's bandana from his pocket, the red fabric he carried everywhere now, and held it between calloused fingers. He'd been thinking about Jake more lately, but differently than before. Not just the loss, though that ached like a bone that had set wrong and never healed properly, but also the presence, the years they'd had, the moments that had built a relationship beyond the blood that connected them. Jake at 6 years old, helping Roy fix a fence and driving nails with fierce concentration. Jake at 12, bringing home a stray dog they'd named Banjo who'd lived on the ranch until old age took it gently. Jake at 16, learning to break colts with patience their grandfather would have recognized, talking to them in that soft voice that understood horses better than people sometimes. All those moments existed independent of the ending, Marcus realized. The tragedy hadn't erased them or made them meaningless. They stood on their own, complete, evidence of a life that had mattered even though it ended too soon. He thought about the last real conversation he'd had with his son, 3 days before the rodeo. They'd been fixing the barn roof where winter had loosened shingles, working side by side the way they'd done 1,000 times before. Jake had been talking about the future, about maybe going to veterinary school, about how he thought he wanted to work with horses professionally instead of just loving them as a hobby. Marcus had been half listening, focused on the work in front of him, offering grunts of acknowledgement instead of real engagement. He'd thought there would be time for deeper conversations later, thought they had years stretching ahead of them to discuss dreams and plans and all the ways life might unfold. The assumption of time, Marcus understood now, was the cruelest lie mortality told. You never knew which conversation would be your last, which morning goodbye would be final, which moment of ordinary routine would be the one you'd replay endlessly after everything changed. If he'd known, he would have stopped working, would have sat down on that roof beside his son and listened, really listened, to every word, would have said things that mattered instead of taking for granted that opportunities for important words would always exist. But he hadn't known, and now Jake was gone, and Marcus was left holding a bandana and a barn full of silence that 2 injured foals were slowly teaching him didn't have to be permanent. The cabin felt different when he returned to it that night. Still small, still bearing the accumulated weight of grief-frozen time, but not quite as suffocating. Marcus made coffee, forgot to drink it, and stood at the window looking toward the barn where weak light glowed between boards. 2 small lives in there depending on him, trusting him with their recovery even though they had every reason to trust nothing and no one. Tommy's face when midnight had touched his palm. Trish's words about Jake being proud. The rhythm of daily care that gave shape to hours that had been formless for so long. All of it was pulling at something inside him, tugging at the locked door he'd built around feeling, testing whether the hinges had rusted solid or might still swing open if pressure was applied correctly. He moved through the cabin like a stranger visiting a crime scene, seeing for the first time how completely he'd let everything deteriorate. Dishes piled in the sink, not from recent use but from months ago when he'd stopped caring about cleanliness or order or any of the small civilized gestures that separated living from merely surviving. Laundry in heaps that had migrated from bedroom to bathroom to wherever they'd been shed. Papers scattered across every surface. Bills unpaid not from lack of money but from lack of will to engage with bureaucracy and obligation. The calendar still showing March 3 years ago. Time stopped like a broken clock. This was what isolation looked like, Marcus thought. This was what happened when you decided that protecting yourself from more pain meant shutting down everything, even the parts that made existence bearable. He'd been so focused on not feeling the bad things that he'd stopped feeling anything at all, and the result was this half-life, this shadow existence, this slow fade into irrelevance. Midnight and Echo couldn't live in a barn tended by someone who was barely alive himself. They needed him functioning, present, engaged with reality instead of hiding from it. And Tommy, showing up day after day with his father's jacket and his mother's biscuits and his uncomplicated willingness to help. That boy deserved better than another adult checking out of life. Marcus started with the dishes, filled the sink with water hot enough to hurt, added soap, and scrubbed until his hands were raw. Each plate cleaned felt like a small declaration of intention, a commitment to the mundane maintenance of daily life. He moved to the laundry next, sorting through piles, loading the machine, listening to the familiar sound of water filling the drum. While that ran, he tackled the papers, sorting them into categories that made sense. Bills to pay, forms to file, letters from people who'd tried to reach him and been met with silence. He couldn't fix 3 years of neglect in one night, but he could start, could take the first steps toward functioning like someone who planned to be around for a while. The calendar was hardest. His hand hovered over it, fingers trembling, before he finally tore it down. The paper ripped, leaving a corner still tacked to the wall, but the rest came free. He held it for a moment, looking at that circled date, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where he kept important papers. Not thrown away, not destroyed, but also not displayed where it could freeze every day in March 3 years ago. He replaced it with a new calendar, one he found in a drawer still in its shrink wrap, a gift from the feed store he'd never bothered opening. He flipped to the current month, February almost over now, and hung it on the same nail. Time started moving again with that simple gesture. Started ticking forward instead of endlessly circling the same wound. Marcus stood back and looked at what he'd accomplished. The cabin wasn't clean, wasn't fixed, wasn't magically restored to what it had been before loss had rearranged everything. But it was better. It was the beginning of better, which was all anyone could ask for. He slept that night without nightmares for the first time in recent memory, and when morning came he woke with purpose instead of dread. The barn was waiting, the Foals were waiting, Tommy would show up after school, and Trish would be back in 2 days to check on Echo's tendon. There were things to do, reasons to get up, small obligations that added up to meaning even if he couldn't quite articulate what that meaning was. Marcus pulled on clean clothes, made coffee he actually drank, and headed into the cold morning where his breath fogged white and the barn waited like a promise he was finally ready to keep. Inside, midnight nickered greeting and Echo watched with eyes that held fractionally less fear than yesterday, and Marcus felt the crack in his chest widen just a little more, letting in light he'd been certain would blind him but instead just helped him see more clearly what had been there all along. The weeks accumulated like snow in drifts, each day adding thin layers that somehow became substantial when you weren't watching. Marcus found himself existing in a new kind of time now, measured not by the clock on the wall or the calendar he'd finally updated, but by the incremental changes in 2 young horses who were learning that the world could be gentle if you let it. Midnight's wounds closed first, the black foal's robust constitution accelerating healing until the angry gashes became pink lines, then pale scars that would eventually be hidden beneath growing hair. The transformation was visible day by day, progress you could track with eyes and hands, proof that damage didn't have to be permanent. Echo's recovery moved slower, complicated by that tendon injury Trish monitored with the kind of attention surgeons gave to delicate operations. The gray foal still favored its right front leg, still moved with careful deliberation that spoke of pain not quite vanquished. But there was improvement, subtle but real, measured in millimeters of increased weight-bearing, in minutes of standing without trembling, in the gradual return of confidence that injury had stolen. Marcus learned to read Echo's pain levels through observation, through the language of pinned ears and shifting stance, through the small signals animals gave when they hurt but couldn't speak it. He adjusted medication schedules, changed bandaging techniques, consulted with Trish through phone calls that became easier each time, until talking to another human felt less like exposure and more like normal function. Tommy had become a fixture in the barn's daily rhythm, arriving with such regularity that Marcus caught himself listening for the sound of small boots on gravel around 3:30 each afternoon. The boy brought more than just his presence. He brought stories from school, complaints about teachers and cafeteria food, excitement about books he was reading and games he'd invented with friends whose names Marcus gradually learned. The chatter filled spaces that silence had occupied too long, created an atmosphere where life happened in present tense instead of past. Marcus found himself responding, not just with grunts and nods but with actual words, actual engagement. He'd ask questions about Tommy's day, offer opinions on the boy's dilemmas, share observations about the foals that Tommy absorbed with the intensity of someone storing wisdom for future use. They developed routines together, unspoken but reliable. Tommy would start with midnight, brushing the black foal's coat until it gleamed, working through tangles in mane and tail with patient fingers, talking the entire time about everything and nothing. Marcus would handle Echo's medical care, the more delicate work that required experienced hands, while Tommy watched and learned. Then they'd switch, Tommy taking over the general care of Echo while Marcus worked with Midnight on basic handling. Leading exercises, teaching the foal to accept a halter without panic, to walk beside a human without fighting, to stand tied for short periods while Marcus worked nearby. Skills any domestic horse needed but wild foals had never encountered, translated through patience and consistency and the kind of repetition that built neural pathways stronger than fear. Echo remained the challenge, the puzzle Marcus couldn't quite solve. The gray foal had moments of softness, brief windows where it would allow touch without flinching, where it would take offered treats from Marcus's palm, where something like trust flickered in dark eyes before fear reasserted itself. But those moments were fragile, easily shattered by unexpected sounds or sudden movements or some internal alarm only Echo could hear. Marcus understood. This wariness went deeper than physical injury, recognized trauma that had carved channels through the foal's psyche, where terror ran like water finding familiar courses. Whoever had chained these animals hadn't just damaged their bodies. They'd taught them that humans were sources of pain, that trust led to betrayal, that vulnerability invited harm. Unlearning those lessons required more than time and care. It required Echo to make a choice, to decide whether the evidence of gentle handling outweighed the memory of cruelty. One afternoon in the third week, Tommy arrived with unusual excitement crackling around him like static electricity. He burst into the barn talking before Marcus could even greet him, words tumbling over each other in his rush to share. There's a man asking around town about horses, young ones that went missing before the storm, offering money for information. Ma heard about it at the grocery store. Marcus felt his stomach drop, that sick lurch of dread when feared things became real. He set down the brush he'd been using on Midnight and turned to face Tommy fully. What kind of man? Tommy's enthusiasm dimmed as he registered Marcus's reaction, realized this news wasn't the neutral information he'd thought it was. I don't know. Ma didn't say. Just that someone was looking and people were talking about it. The barn suddenly felt smaller, walls pressing in with the weight of threat that had been abstract before but was now taking concrete shape. Marcus had known this was coming, had known from the moment he'd cut those chains that whoever put them there wouldn't simply accept their loss. But knowing intellectually and facing practically were different animals entirely. He moved to the barn door and looked out across his property, seeing it now through strategic eyes. The ranch sat back from the main road, screened by a line of pines that provided privacy most of the year. But those same trees that hid him from casual view would also hide anyone approaching who didn't want to be seen. The driveway was long, gravel that crunched under tires, which gave warning but also meant no quick escape. The barn had one main entrance and two smaller doors, defensible if you were thinking in those terms, which apparently Marcus was now. Tommy had followed him to the door, picking up on the tension rolling off Marcus in waves. Are they in trouble? The foals? Marcus wanted to lie, wanted to protect this child from adult complications and moral ambiguity and all the ways the world got complicated when you tried to do right things. But Tommy deserved honesty, had earned it through his daily presence and genuine care. I don't know yet, but someone hurt them on purpose, chained them up and left them to die. If that someone is looking for them now, it's not because they suddenly grew a conscience. The boy's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Confusion, then understanding, then a hardening that looked wrong on someone so young but was becoming disturbingly common in children who'd learned early that the world wasn't safe or fair. We can't let them take Midnight and Echo back. Not back to being hurt. Marcus felt something warm and painful expand in his chest at the way Tommy said we, at the assumption of partnership, at this child's immediate leap to protection rather than self-preservation. No, he agreed. We can't. But we also can't hide forever. Need to figure out who's looking and why, and what legal standing anyone has to claim them. He thought of Sheriff Mackenzie, of the conversation he'd been avoiding, of the official channels he'd need to navigate if this escalated beyond rumors in grocery stores. Tommy shifted his weight, old work gloves dangling from coat pockets, looking suddenly older than his 10 years. My dad used to say the law and what's right don't always shake hands. Marcus felt that familiar ache, that echo of Roy's presence carried forward through his son's words. Your dad was right about that too. That evening, after Tommy had reluctantly gone home with promises to keep his ears open for more information, Marcus stood in the barn with just the Foals and his racing thoughts for company. Midnight sensed his agitation, responding with restlessness that manifested in pawing and head tossing, picking up on energy Marcus couldn't quite conceal. Echo watched from its stall with that sideways wariness that had become familiar, reading threat in Marcus's tension even if it wasn't directed at them. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to unclench his jaw, to find the calm center that animals needed from humans who claimed to care for them. The Foals hadn't asked for any of this. Hadn't asked to be stolen from wherever they'd come from originally, hadn't asked to be chained and abandoned, hadn't asked to become the center of conflicts between human concepts of ownership and ethics and legal standing. They'd just been trying to survive, same as everything else that breathed. That they'd ended up here, in his barn, dependent on his protection, felt like responsibility bordering on sacred obligation. Marcus wasn't a religious man, hadn't been inside a church since Jake's funeral, but standing there with lantern light casting long shadows and two small horses watching him with varying degrees of trust, he felt something that might have been prayer or might have been promise. He wouldn't let them be taken back to suffering. Wouldn't allow whatever human had treated them as disposable to reclaim them as property. The law might have things to say about that, might side with documented ownership over moral imperative, but Marcus had spent 3 years learning that some rules were worth breaking if the alternative was complicity with cruelty. He'd figure out the legalities, would call Sheriff Mackenzie in the morning, would do everything possible through proper channels. But if it came down to a choice between legal compliance and protecting these foals, Marcus knew which side of that line he'd stand on. Some things mattered more than law, more than property rights, more than the comfortable fiction that systems would deliver justice if you just followed procedures correctly. The night stretched long and Marcus found himself unable to leave the barn, unable to retreat to the cabin while threat circled undefined in the dark beyond his property line. He pulled up a hay bale and sat back against the wall, watching Midnight and Echo settle into their evening routine. The black foal lay down first, folding legs beneath its body with the flexibility young horses possessed, lowering itself to the straw with barely a sound. Echo remained standing longer, always more vigilant, always slower to relax. But eventually exhaustion won, and the gray foal too folded down, choosing a spot where it could watch both the barn door and Midnight simultaneously. They slept like wild things even now, alert in their rest, ready to spring up at the first sign of danger. That wariness would probably never fully leave them, Marcus thought. Would always be there beneath whatever domestication they achieved, a legacy of trauma that became part of who they were. But maybe that wasn't entirely bad. Maybe remembering danger kept you sharp enough to avoid it next time. Maybe the scars we carried, visible and invisible, were just proof we'd survived things that tried to kill us. Morning found Marcus stiff and cold, having dozed fitfully through the night in the barn. Tommy appeared at his usual time, took one look at Marcus's face, and asked no questions about why he obviously hadn't slept in a bed. The boy simply set about the morning chores with quiet efficiency, giving Marcus space to pull himself together and time to drink the coffee Tommy had thought to bring in a battered thermos. By noon Marcus had made the call he'd been avoiding, had gotten through to Sheriff Mackenzie, had explained the situation in broad strokes that left out nothing relevant, but also didn't volunteer more than necessary. Lewis Mackenzie had been sheriff of this county for 20 years, had known Marcus since before Jake was born, had stood at the funeral with tears running down his weathered face. He listened now without interruption, let Marcus finish the whole story before responding with the careful consideration of someone who understood that law and justice sometimes pulled in opposite directions. "I'll look into it," Mackenzie said finally. "See who's making noise and what claim they might have. But Marcus, you need to understand something. If someone has papers showing ownership, if they bought those foals legally before whatever happened, the law's on their side regardless of how they treated them after. Animal cruelty's hard to prove, harder to prosecute, and usually results in nothing more than fines even when you can make it stick." Marcus's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. "So what you're telling me is I should have left them to die. That would have been simpler legally." There was a long pause, filled with static and the weight of things neither man wanted to say aloud. "I'm telling you that doing the right thing doesn't always come with legal protection. Sometimes it comes with complications. But I'll do what I can, and that's not nothing." The call ended with promises to stay in touch, to share information as it developed, to navigate this situation with as much care as official capacity allowed. Marcus hung up feeling simultaneously supported and helpless, grateful for Mackenzie's willingness to help but clear-eyed about the limitations of what help could accomplish within system constraints. He returned to the barn where Tommy had both foals groomed and fed, where Midnight nuzzled the boy's pockets looking for treats, where Echo watched from its stall with those dark eyes that had seen too much. Marcus looked at them, these two small lives that had somehow become the axis around which his world turned, and felt resolve settle into his bones. Whatever came next, whoever showed up claiming ownership, whatever legal or illegal measures became necessary, he would protect them. Would show up every day, would do what needed doing, would stand between them and harm the way he hadn't been able to stand between Jake and that bronc, between Roy and that patch of black ice, between all the people he'd loved and the random cruelty of a universe that didn't care about fairness. Maybe he couldn't control outcomes. Maybe effort didn't guarantee success. But he could control his presence, his commitment, his willingness to fight for something beyond himself. And right now, in this barn, with morning light slanting through gaps in old wood and two foals depending on him, that felt like enough. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.